May 17th, 1966, 3:33 a.m. Hotel Chelsea, New York City. Bob Dylan was deep in the strangest creative period of his life, when reality began to bend around him like one of Salvador Dali's melting clocks. He had been awake for nearly 48 hours straight, fueled by coffee, amphetamines, and the manic energy that was producing what would become Blonde on Blonde, his most surreal and experimental album. That night, in his room at the infamous Hotel Chelsea, Dylan experienced something that forever changed his understanding of art, consciousness, and the thin line between genius and madness. Whether it was a dream, a hallucination, or something else entirely, Dylan would never be sure. But what he encountered in those pre-dawn hours created the most bizarre and beautiful song he ever wrote. A song so strange that he was afraid to release it. The master of surrealism himself, Salvador Dalí, stepped out of Dylan's subconscious and into his hotel room, carrying a melting guitar and wearing his famous upturned mustache like a question mark against reality. Dylan had been sitting at his typewriter, trying to capture the sound of time dissolving, when he heard a knock at his door. But the knock wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside his own head, rhythmic and hypnotic, like a heartbeat made of music. "Come in," Dylan said without thinking, though he wasn't sure if he had spoken aloud or just thought the words. The door opened, but instead of swinging on its hinges, it melted like warm wax, dripping upward into the ceiling. Through this impossible opening stepped Salvador Dalí, exactly as Dylan had seen him in photographs, but somehow more real than real, hyper-vivid, three-dimensional, with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. "Ah, Roberto Dylan," Dalí said in his theatrical Spanish accent. "I have been expecting you in the landscape of dreams for quite some time." Dylan stared, wondering if he was finally experiencing the complete mental breakdown that everyone had been predicting since he went electric. "You're Salvador Dalí, but you're here, in my hotel room, at 3 in the morning. Dalí smiled, his mustache curling impossibly upward. "Time is an illusion, my friend. Space is a suggestion. Art is the only reality that matters. In dreams, all great artists meet to discuss the important things." "What important things?" Dalí walked to Dylan's window, but instead of looking out at 23rd Street, the view showed a vast desert landscape filled with giant pocket watches draped over bare tree branches. The relationship between madness and creation, the way music can bend reality just as surely as a painter's brush. Dylan approached the window, mesmerized. That's impossible." "Impossible is just another word for not yet invented," Dalí replied. "Your lyrics, Roberto, they do the same thing my paintings do. They show people that reality is far more fluid than they imagine. My lyrics are just words, stories, protest songs." Dalí laughed, a sound like silver bells being played underwater. "Just words? Listen to yourself. The pump don't work 'cause the vandals took the handles. That is pure surrealism. You paint pictures with sounds that exist nowhere but in the imagination." Dylan had never thought of his songwriting as painting, but as Dalí spoke, he began to see connections he had never noticed before. "Show me," Dylan said. "Show me what you mean." Dalí reached into the air and pulled out a guitar that seemed to be made of liquid mercury, its neck bending and flowing like water, but somehow maintaining its essential guitarness. "Music," Dalí said, offering the instrument to Dylan, "is liquid time. When you play, you are not just making sounds. You are sculpting temporal space, creating emotional architecture that exists only in the moment of listening. Dylan took the impossible guitar, and to his amazement, it felt solid in his hands despite its fluid appearance. When he strummed the strings, the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. Notes that seemed to have colors, harmonies that tasted like memories, rhythms that felt like walking through different dimensions. "What is this?" Dylan whispered, amazed. "This is what happens when you stop trying to make sense and start trying to make truth," Dalí replied. "Sense is overrated. Truth is eternal." For the next several hours, though time seemed to move in spirals rather than straight lines, Dalí guided Dylan through the most extraordinary artistic conversation of his life. "Tell me about madness," Dylan said, as he continued to play the liquid guitar, its notes creating visual patterns in the air between them. "Ah, madness!" Dalí's eyes lit up like candles in a cathedral. "Madness is not the opposite of sanity, my friend. Madness is sanity turned inside out so you can see how it works. The mad person sees connections that the sane person has trained themselves to ignore. But isn't madness dangerous? Of course. So is art. So is love. So is being alive. The safe path leads nowhere interesting." Dalí gestured grandly, and his movements left temporary trails of color in the air. "The question is not whether madness is dangerous, but whether it is more dangerous than staying sane in an insane world." Dylan stopped playing for a moment, struck by the profundity of what Dalí had said. "You think the world is insane? Look around you. War, poverty, hatred, people destroying the only planet they have to live on. And we call the artists mad for pointing out these contradictions through metaphor and symbol." As if to illustrate his point, the hotel room around them began to shift and change. The walls became transparent, showing glimpses of the world outside. Not just New York, but all the world simultaneously. Dylan could see Vietnam, civil rights marches, protests, celebrations, births, deaths, all happening at once in a kaleidoscope of human experience. "This is what you see when you write," Dalí said. "This is why your songs seem so strange to people. You are showing them the whole picture at once, instead of the tiny slice they are used to seeing." Dylan understood something fundamental about his own creative process for the first time. "I don't consciously try to be surreal. It just comes out that way." "Exactly. Because you have learned to trust the unconscious mind, the dream logic, the part of yourself that knows things your rational mind has not yet discovered." Dalí reached into his jacket and pulled out a paintbrush that was also somehow a pen, also somehow a microphone. "Watch this," he said, and began to paint in the air. As he painted, colors became sounds, brushstrokes became melodies, and the entire room filled with a symphony that Dylan could both hear and see. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. "Now you try," Dalí said, handing Dylan the impossible pen brush microphone. Dylan took it hesitantly. "I don't know how to paint." "You paint every time you write a song. You paint pictures in the listener's mind. This is just more direct." Dylan began to move the brush through the air, and to his amazement, lyrics began to appear as visible entities, floating and dancing around the room. But these weren't ordinary lyrics. They were alive, changing, responding to each other, creating meaning through their movement as much as their words. "Incredible," Dylan breathed. "This is the secret," Dalí said, his voice becoming more serious. "Reality is not fixed. It is a collaborative hallucination that we all agree to participate in. But artists, true artists, they remember that it's a hallucination. They remember that it can be changed, reimagined, transformed. So what's our responsibility? To show people new possibilities, to break the patterns that trap them in limited thinking, to remind them that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than they have been taught to believe. As dawn approached, though the light seemed to come from multiple suns in impossible colors, Dalí began to fade, becoming translucent like a watercolor painting left in the rain. "Wait," Dylan said urgently. "I'm not finished learning." "You are never finished learning," Dalí replied, his voice becoming distant and echo-like. "But you have learned enough for now. Take what we have discovered together and make it into music. Show the world what we have seen." "But how do I explain this? How do I translate a dream into a song?" Dalí's smile was the last thing to fade, hanging in the air like the Cheshire Cat's grin. "Don't translate it, Roberto. Recreate it. Let the song be as impossible as this conversation. Let it be proof that reality is far more flexible than anyone imagines." And then Dylan was alone in his hotel room, with only the memory of the most extraordinary artistic encounter of his life and the impossible song that was already beginning to form in his mind. Dylan spent the next 6 hours writing furiously, trying to capture not just what Dalí had said, but the feeling of the entire experience. The resulting song was unlike anything he had ever created, a stream of consciousness journey through landscapes of dream and meaning, filled with images that shifted and flowed like Dalí's melting clocks. The song had no traditional structure. It moved through different musical sections, like someone walking through rooms in a surreal house, each space revealing new perspectives on reality, art, and the relationship between madness and truth. When Dylan's producer heard the recording, he was baffled. "Bob, I don't know what this is. It's beautiful, but it's also completely insane. I'm not sure radio stations would know what to do with it." "Maybe that's the point," Dylan replied. "Maybe we need songs that radio stations don't know what to do with." The song was never released, as a single, never performed on television, never promoted in the conventional sense. But it became legendary among musicians and artists who understood what Dylan had achieved, a piece of music that operated by dream logic rather than commercial logic, that prioritized emotional truth over literal meaning. Years later, Dylan would say that the song represented a breakthrough in his understanding of what art could do. "I stopped trying to make sense and started trying to make truth," he explained in a 1975 interview, unconsciously echoing Dalí's words from that impossible night. The influence of his encounter with Dalí, whether real, imagined, or something in between, permeated the entire Blonde on Blonde album. Songs like Visions of Johanna and Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again showed a new willingness to embrace the irrational, to let meaning emerge through association and juxtaposition rather than linear narrative. Musicians who worked with Dylan during this period noted a change in his approach to recording. He became more willing to follow his instincts into strange territories, more interested in capturing the feeling of a moment than in creating perfect, polished products. "Bob taught me that some of the best art happens when you stop trying to control the process and start collaborating with the mystery," said Al Cooper, who played organ on many of the Blonde on Blonde sessions. The secret song that emerged from Dylan's encounter with Dalí was finally released decades later as part of a boxed set of unreleased material. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece of experimental music. Others dismissed it as self-indulgent nonsense. But for those who understood